first welcome for the presenters for the next session, the Hazards, which is the hazards of smoking and the benefits of cessation. We have two distinguished speakers, Professor Georges Khayat, and we have the professor as well, David Khayat from France. Professor Georges Khayat is from Lebanon. And I wonder, just a question for our distinguished speakers. Are you cousins or relatives, Professor Georges and Professor David?
No, not at all. Sorry.
But
I would love to meet you.
Yes. Both are francophone.
Hopefully in Paris, maybe.
Yes, or in Beirut.
Also.
Because I just wonder this, both of you are Khayat as a family name. So that would be a very interesting session on the hazards of smoking and the non-communicable diseases and the benefits of cessations with the pros and cons. And let me introduce first the first speaker, Professor Georges Khayat. He's going to address for us the harmful effects of electronic cigarettes, particularly in patients with lung cancer. Professor Georges Khayat is a chest physician at Hôtel Dieu de France, ERS board certified in adult respiratory medicine. He's associate professor in pulmonary medicine, St. Joseph University, and director of pulmonary medicine teaching program at St. Joseph University. Let me first start in this session to mention that this is a platform session. It's live. We have many registered physicians attending this session. We have hundreds attending this session, and it's a hybrid session. Hopefully, by next year, after this COVID thing, we can meet physically at least, and be all together, inshallah, as we say in Arabic. Let me first introduce Georges. Georges, the platform is yours, and you can start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. My slides are appearing in the screen, hopefully, because I shared screen just now.
Yes, yes, you can see it, Mr. Georges.
Okay. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, even virtually. And I'm very pleased also that the LPS is part of the scientific activity. I wish to thank the Professor Tariq Safwat and the Egyptian Scientific Society of Bronchology for this invitation. And I hope that this will be an opportunity to foster in the future the collaboration between our two societies. I've been asked to talk about the harmful effects of e-cigarettes, and I will try in the coming 15 minutes to show a quick overview of this very large and very controversial topic. I have no conflict of interest in relation to this talk, and so I'm going to talk about mainly e-cigarettes, and e-cigarettes was developed at the beginning of the 21st century. There are three components in these cigarettes: the power source, which is usually a lithium battery, the atomizer, which heats the liquid to produce vapor, and the reservoir that holds the e-liquid. This e-liquid contains mainly nicotine in various concentrations, a liquid vehicle, which is glycerol and propylene glycol usually, and we have flavorings and we have sweeteners. So as you can see in this slide, e-cigarette is relatively young. It was brought into the market in 2006 in Europe and in 2007 in the US. And it grows very rapidly, and the prevalence increases in all ages. According to several surveys in the US, the prevalence of ever tried e-cigarettes and regular use of e-cigarettes in adults increases around 10 times on a 3-year period from 2010 to 2013. Similarly, it increases also around 10 times in high school students, in middle school students during a 4-year period from 2011 to 2015. And it was the most commonly used product in this population of students in 2014. As e-cigarettes gain popularity, newer devices become, it says that my screen is paused. Is it paused?
Yes, it's paused. So can we proceed with the next slide, please?
Yes, okay, it's okay? No.
No. Yes, no, it's okay. It's okay, Professor.
Okay. So as the popularity increases, newer devices are developed, more attractive, more convenient, more customizable, and the newer generations of e-cigarettes allow customization in the power of the battery, in the resistance, in the temperature, and all this gives the user a way to increase the quantity of inhaled nicotine. Unfortunately, the use of e-cigarettes are promoted by intense marketing with advertising campaign, with discounted price promotion, etc. And smokers prefer to use this kind of devices because they feel that it is less harm and a harmful source of nicotine for them and for their family. I don't know why it's not moved. Okay. Is it really harmless? FDA showed that the vapors from e-cigarettes contain the same toxic chemicals found in traditional cigarettes and also accumulate in the airway epithelium. Use of e-cigarettes also appears to be an independent risk factor for respiratory disease, as the conventional smoking products over a 3-year follow-up period, and there are growing body of literature that shows that the effects of e-cigarettes are similar to conventional tobacco at a cellular, at a clinical, and at a population level. And it is a little bit worrisome that some of the toxicities are unique to e-cigarettes. So there are new toxicities appearing with e-cigarettes that are not showed with smoking tobacco. This is a kind of toxicity that is like a risk, let's say, because some users try to modify their e-cigarettes, try to increase the power of the battery of their device to get a greater nicotine hit. Others drip directly e-liquid on the atomizer to inhale a vapor more rich in nicotine. And these habits could increase the chance of fire and battery explosion. Propylene glycol is used as in the e-liquid as vehicle because it seems that he has a low toxicity. Nevertheless, ocular and upper respiratory irritation were reported in non-asthmatic adults with this product. Diacetyl and other flavorings are all aldehydes, and these aldehydes could activate receptors in sensory neurons in rodents' airways, which trigger neurogenic inflammation, and they may also inhibit CFTR ion channel, which may be toxic to the lung. Moreover, aerosols, e-cigarette aerosols contains oxidants and reactive oxygen species that have adverse biological effects. Let's talk about nicotine. We know that nicotine is the addiction product, but nicotine also causes a lot of physiological changes through nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, particularly in the airways. Inhaled nicotine cause airway irritation, cause cough reflex, alters the cell proliferation and apoptosis in bronchial epithelia. Also, the receptors of nicotine, alpha-3, alpha-5, beta-4, were identified as candidate genes for a potential role in lung cancer from genome-wide association studies. And some authors found different receptors subunit gene expression profiles between non-smokers and smokers with non-small cell lung cancer. As nicotine upregulates these receptors, and as these receptors contributes to maybe to non-small cell lung cancer by altering cell proliferation and apoptotic resistance, it may be that nicotine plays a role in development of lung cancer. Let's talk about COPD. In COPD, we have a lot of cells contributing to the pathogenesis, and these cells express nicotine acetylcholine receptors. And so nicotine influences these cells. It suppresses monocytes and macrophages. It has a pro-inflammatory action on neutrophils. These action could play a role in COPD. Interestingly, the anti-inflammatory effect of nicotine on monocytes and macrophages may be negated in the case of cigarette smoke by the presence of other pro-inflammatory products like tar phase. And in the e-cigarettes, we have no pro-inflammatory products, so the anti-inflammatory effects of nicotine could be a lot higher and could suppress the user's immune system. High nicotine exposure from e-cigarettes also would be a major pharmacological player in all the organs where N-acetylcholine receptors are expressed, principally in the lung. So it may affect inflammation in the airways, it may alter the user's susceptibility to infection, and it may increase the risk of developing COPD and lung cancer. In this publication, very recent publication, the authors concluded that there is a strong link between the couple nicotine and acetylcholine receptors and lung cancer risk. And there is also an association with drug resistance, which involve also the pathway of sirtuin receptors. Researchers from Boston suggested that exposure to e-vapors might increase the risk of lung cancer. They exposed human bronchial epithelium cells to e-cigarette vapors, and it shows a similar pattern of gene expression as the pattern shown by exposure to tobacco smoke of the epithelium. Also, e-cigarette exposure could have a booster effect on the expression of some enzyme in the lung, could produce free radical and oxidation-induced DNA damage in the lungs. And all this suggests that e-cigarette aerosol increase DNA mutations and cancer-causing changes. Mainly, it was described in rats. Tang and al. Make important findings. They found that inhaled nicotine in mice could induce lung cancer, and the effect is a direct one because it appears in the lungs but not in the bladder, where the contact is not obviously direct. In the e-liquid, you have nicotine, but we have also flavors, we have sweeteners, we have other chemicals which are also maybe toxic and which alter physiology, airway physiology. Vardavas found that there is significant increase in peripheral airway resistance, indicative maybe of an action on the small airways, and also significant decrease in exhaled nitric oxide levels. And nitric oxide can affect ciliary beating, transcription, inflammation, ion transport, and airway smooth muscle tone. So this could be a cause for various lung disease. This slide is just to summarize the effects, and as I show you and as I found in the literature, there is dozens of publications talking about the effects of e-cigarettes, and you see how large is it. So it impacts multiple regions, it impacts multiple functions in the respiratory system. EVALI. What is EVALI? EVALI is a e-cigarette vaping product associated lung injury, described early 2019, but it seems that it exists since 2008. It is the association of a clinical picture associating hypoxia with respiratory symptoms, imaging, chest imaging abnormalities, and intense inflammatory response, which can cause respiratory failure. This was described with mortality, as we have 68 deaths out of 2,800 cases hospitalized in the US. And it seems that the majority of these deaths are related to cannabinoids. It's 80%, but we have 20%, which could be related to a cigarette, and not to the cannabinoid. We have also concern about second-hand aerosol. Second-hand aerosol, we can call it also passive vaping. As a matter of fact, there is findings that raise concern over the use of e-cigarettes in public places for the passive part of it. We have ultrafine particles which are formed from supersaturated 1,2-propanediol vapor that can be deposited in the lungs. We have aerosol nicotine, which seems capable of increasing the release of the inflammatory signaling molecule, NO, when inhaled. If we expose non-smokers to second-hand aerosol 2 hours a day, they absorb nicotine like second-hand smoke exposure. And if we measure the salivary cotinine concentration, we have the same concentrations. These findings raise concern about the use of e-cigarettes in public places, and but it remains till now unclear. We need more research. The extrapulmonary toxicity also are not very clear. There is only scant reports about like toxicity on mainly on the cardiovascular system, but also gastrointestinal system, neurological system. The harm also is at a level of public health, because as we already said, the public maybe is too much convinced that electronic cigarettes are not harmful. And so people use electronic devices to stop smoking, to be more safe, let's say. And unfortunately, we have more and more dual users of e-cigarettes and conventional smoking system. which you see in a study in more than 5,000 Americans, 75% of them was smoking and vaping together. And this increased toxicity because we have the tobacco toxicity and we have the electronic device toxicities. More important, the increase of using the e-cigarettes in the youth, it's a gateway to addiction. And this use on a large scale increases the risk of teenagers to become adult smokers after being teenager vapors. Very difficult to conclude. Why? Because exposure to nicotine and characteristics of potentially toxic substances emitted from e-cigarette are highly variable and depend on product characteristics, the device, the e-liquid, and on the pattern of vaping by the user. And unfortunately, the devices are very varied because they are manufactured in a very high number of ways. The e-liquid are varied, the pattern of vaping are varied. This is the first part. The second part, the studies designed that try to study the toxicity of e-vaping is very varied also. And we have often studies fraught with bias because of principally the dual use and the fact that the participants in these studies are former smokers or even actual smokers with e-cigarette vaping together. And all these variabilities contribute to inconsistency of available data. At the end, we can say, I guess without risk to be wrong, that acute toxicity is worse with e-cigarettes, as we saw EVALI and all others action, very, let's say, acute or rapid action of e-cigarettes, different from what we see with tobacco. On the other hand, long-term toxicity seems to be here, but needs very research to be clarified. Second-hand aerosol may be a problem, and it needs to be studied. And vaping is a public health problem, especially in the youth generation. And we hope that this will be controlled somehow in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor George, for your illustrative about the harm of e-cigarettes. And we'll postpone the questions after the second speaker, Professor David Khayat. Professor David Khayat is going to address for us the harm reduction in NCDs, non-communicable diseases. And let me introduce Professor David Khayat. He's the head of the Department of Medical Oncology at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital. He is professor of oncology at the University Pierre and Marie Curie and adjunct professor at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. And he is the founder and the president of the foundation AVEC. Professor David, the floor is yours. You can start your presentation and the questions will be following your presentation. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Professor David Khayat. I am an oncologist from France. And I have to say it's a great pleasure for me to participate to this meeting organized in Egypt by my friend, Dr. Tarek Safwat. And it's my pleasure also to share with you my experience on the concept of harm reduction in the field of tobacco smoking. Before I start my lecture, I want to introduce myself. I have been the head of the Department of Medical Oncology at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital for almost 30 years. I've been also the former president of the French National Cancer Institute. And between 2002 and 2006, I was the advisor of the president of France at that time, Mr. Jacques Chirac. Before I start my lecture, my conflict of interest, I've been working, and I'm still working with many food companies, working on processing and transform food, and also to Philip Morris, but only on harm reduction. I have been asked to work on the concept of harm reduction in the context of cancer. For working on that issue, I want to tell you what I've done as advisor of Jacques Chirac at that time. I was considered as the most rigorous fighter against cancer in my country. Between 2002 and 2004, I completely raised the cost of a pack of cigarettes from 3 to 4 and then 4 to 5 euros, which is a very rapid and significant increase in the cost of cigarettes. Because of that, or thanks to that, we had 1.8 million less smokers in my country. And I think we were quite happy with this outcome. Actually, the sales of stick of cigarettes in France went down from 80 billion a year down to 55 billion a year. And I wrote the law for a ban of smoking in public places. Now, if we want to discuss about the concept of harm reduction in the context of cancer, we have to first discuss about what we know. We know two things. One, what is a cancer? Cancer is an unlimited and uncontrolled proliferation of mutated cells. And these unrepaired mutations are usually due to the effect of an exposure to a carcinogen. And we'll come back to that. The second thing we know is that cancer is a major public health issue. So when we start looking at the numbers, we can see that the global burden of NCDs, at least in 2016, out of almost 57 million deaths in the world, 40.5 million deaths were coming from NCD, which represent about 71%. Out of them, NCDs are made of cardiovascular diseases, respiratory disease, cancer, and many other chronic diseases. 9 million of these deaths related to NCD were due to cancer. If we look more specifically at the situation on the burden of NCD in Egypt, we can see that out of about 600,000 deaths that occur every year in Egypt, about 84% of them, which means 511,000 people are dying from NCD, and out of them, almost 80,000 of these people are dying because of cancer. Why? Because there's many very bad behaviors that we can see in this country. One is that almost a quarter of the citizens are smoking, 24%. And we can see that this number is increasing because of the growing use of shisha. Besides that, we have more than 40% of people that are affected by obesity, and 75% are not involved in physical activity. Plus, the average daily salt intake is very high. It's almost the double of the recommended dose according to WHO. Okay, we know NCDs, we know within NCDs what is the risk of cancer. Now we have to understand what are the conditions for a cancer to happen. It's very easy. Cancer is always due to the exposure to a carcinogen. And when we start to discuss about this carcinogen that can be present in your diet, in the water, in the pollution in the air, that can be due to physical factors such as sun exposure, for instance, there is always something that you have to understand, is that the cancer development is always a matter of dose response, which means that the greater amount of carcinogen you are exposed to, the higher your risk of cancer. So this exposure is very important. And we have to consider the amount of exposure through different possibilities. One is the dose, second is the duration, and third, the genetic susceptibility. If you look on that slide, you can see the dose-response relationship, for instance, in the field of colorectal cancer, where you can see that more processed meat and red meat you eat, higher your risk of colorectal cancer. At the opposite, higher the quantity of fish you eat, which means usually that you don't eat so much meat, lower your risk of colorectal cancer. So it's a question of dose. If we look at the duration, we can see this slide with the duration of your exposure to cigarette smoke. You can see that whatever you smoke, 1 pack a day, 2, 3 pack a day, the point is that longer the duration of your exposure, the number of years where you have been smoking, higher your risk to develop a lung cancer. And the last one is the genetic susceptibility. It's very important to understand that also, because if we look at the relationship between smoking and lung cancer, we can state that although 80% of lung cancer will occur in smokers, only 8% of smokers will develop lung cancer. So there is a genetic susceptibility. 8% are susceptible to develop lung cancer if they smoke, but all the rest of the population will not. So when we say that, what can we do? We have 4 ways to try to decrease the risk related to the exposure to a carcinogen. And we can take the example of tobacco, but not only tobacco. We can eliminate the exposure to a carcinogen. We can use an anti-carcinogen, like an anti-poison. We can reduce the exposure to carcinogen, or we try to detect the susceptibility to do a prevention that will be more targeted. If we look at the first possibility, elimination of carcinogens, we have 2 examples that are very important. One is about alcohol. You remember in the 30s in the United States, alcohol prohibition, it didn't work. If we look at tobacco, we know that the situation of the tobacco control policy in the world is based on the treaty that has been signed in 2005, which is a global international treaty that states what countries should do to eradicate smoking. And that treaty says only eradicate smoking, not looking how can we eradicate smoking. So if we ask the question, does it work? The best way to answer that question is to look at the causes of cancer in Egypt at 2 times. One, in the year 1990, about 30 years ago, we can see that at that time, the first cause of cancer in Egypt was tobacco smoking. Then we had high body mass index, obesity, we had type 2 diabetes, we had alcohol, and so many other causes. But when we look at what happened to this ranking 30 years ago in the year 2019, still in Egypt, we can see that 30 years ago, the first cause of cancer was smoking. 30 years later, although the governments have developed a lot of strategies to try to decrease the prevalence of smoking, increasing the price of the pack of cigarettes and many other ways, smoking 30 years later is still the first cause of cancer in Egypt. Few things have moved. For instance, type 2 diabetes, which was in the 6th position, became onto the 3rd position. But we can see that most of these causes of cancer are behavioral. And what is very important is to see that all the strategies that have been implemented to try to decrease the prevalence of smoking in Egypt, unfortunately, have failed. Smoking was the first of cancer 90 years ago. Smoking is still the first cause of cancer today.
The second possibility is to use an anti-poison. For instance, we know that processed meat can induce colorectal cancer. But there have been several very interesting studies that have shown that if you take some vitamin C or vitamin E or even calcium at the time you eat processed meat, you will decrease totally the carcinogenic effect of the processed meat on the risk of colorectal cancer. We know also that you have to be very careful with that idea of anti-poison, because you may remember that at some point about 20 years ago, we thought that retinoids, carotenoids, some derivatives of the vitamin A, we thought that these will be able to decrease the risk of lung cancer in smokers. And there have been 2 very interesting studies, one called CARET and the other one called ATDC. Most of them show that people, there were randomized international studies where half of the people randomized to take these retinoids and half take some placebo. And at the end of the day, the people who took the retinoids that were supposed to prevent cancer got a very higher number of lung cancer. So it didn't work at all. It was even worsening the situation. We can use also vaccination against cervical cancer due to HPV. The third strategy is called harm reduction, which is a reduction of the exposure to the carcinogens. Harm reduction is not so much a new concept. If we look at when it started, where Mrs. Thatcher, at that time Prime Minister of the UK, decided to try to avoid IV drug addicted people to get, beside their addiction to drug, to get HIV or viral hepatitis. And for that, she provided them with clean syringes, clean needles, and safe balance. Thanks to that, the number of people infected by the HIV or the viral hepatitis virus went down in that population very, very significantly. Unfortunately, about 10 years ago, a new think tank in England decided to change completely that policy and start a new policy, which is abstinence-based policy. So no more needles, no more syringes, and what happened is that within a few years, UK had the highest rate of fatalities in the population of IV drug-addicted people. If we want to reduce the exposure, which is a concept of harm reduction, to a carcinogen, we have to identify the nature, the production, and the exposure source of carcinogen. And if we take the tobacco smoking, we can ask the question, how does cancer smoke can cause cancer? Well, because when you burn tobacco leaves, you produce a smoke. And within that smoke, you will find a huge number, about 6,000 compounds and ultrafine particles. Several of them, about 93, are considered as harmful or potentially harmful constituent of the tobacco smoke. And about 80 out of these 93 can be considered as real carcinogen or potential carcinogen. How these carcinogens or these chemicals are produced in the tobacco smoke? Well, they are produced because when you burn the tobacco leaves, you produce these particles and these constituents. But you need to burn the leaves. If you look at that slide, you can see that if you just heat the tobacco leaves less than 350 centigrade, you will not produce most of this carcinogen. But as soon as you stop eating and start burning the cigarettes, then you got the production of these very harmful constituents such as benzodiazepine and other carcinogens. And remember, what is very important is that you have to understand that in cancer, there is always a dose-response relationship between the exposure to a carcinogen and your own personal risk of cancer. Higher the exposure, higher your risk of cancer. So if you say that, let's come to zero. And indeed, quitting tobacco smoking is by far the best option. Can we achieve that? Have we been able to achieve that in the past? Well, if you look at that slide, you will understand that no. Because there is a study that's shown that if you take people that have been diagnosed with lung cancer and ask them to quit smoking, you can see that more than 60% of them will continue to smoke, even though they have a lung cancer, even though their life is in danger because of this very lethal disease. And this is true on every type of behavior, true from diet, for people affected with diabetes, with sun exposure, for instance, with skin cancer, with many other things. The concept of harm reduction is based on the idea that if you cannot change your bad behavior, we can maybe try to help you to get less harms from that bad behavior. And this is what is happening, for instance, if you drive your car, the people have invented some airbags, seat belts, disc brakes, and everything. Regarding sun exposure, we have sunscreen. For people having a bad diet, we have statins, we have anti-diabetic drugs. So if we can completely change the behavior, it's better. But if we cannot, then our duty is to try to decrease the risk of having a bad disease, including cancer. So are there some innovation like that, but in the field of tobacco smoking? Yes, we have snus, which is not a device. It's a little oral nicotine. You have the e-cigarettes and you have the heated tobacco. In July 2020, the US FDA has approved the heated tobacco device as being able to promote the public health in the United States, expected to benefit of the health of the entire population. Why? Because looking with their own study on what was present in the aerosol coming from this heated tobacco device, they found that there was no combustion in IQOS. There was a very significantly reduced level of toxicant than cigarettes. You can see that on the right part of the slide. When we say reduce, we say something like 90% reduction. That smokers that would switch completely to IQOS will reduce their risk exposure to toxicant. And therefore, IQOS has a potential lower risk than combustible cigarette. And this is very important because if you look at the cancer potency of carcinogens and tobacco-containing products, you can see that if you consider combustible cigarettes of having a risk of 100% And if you compare the risk induced by either e-cigarettes or by heated tobacco, such as IQOS, and this has been done by Dr. Stephens, you can consider that e-cigarettes, compared to 100% for combustible cigarettes, e-cigarettes will be only 0.02 and IQOS will be 0.03. So when we talk about decrease, we're not talking about a small decrease. We are talking about a very important decrease, what we can consider as a real cliff in the reduction of the exposure. And another study that has been published very recently by the authors from the RIVM, which is the equivalent of FDA in the Netherlands, they have been trying to set up a method to understand how any present or future device will decrease the risk of cancer compared to combustible cigarette. They set up kind of methods, and they published the results a few months ago showing that the IQOS will produce a 10 to 25-fold lower exposure to carcinogen than cigarette. So if you reduce the exposure to a carcinogen, you will reduce your risk of developing cancer. Now, what is the conclusion? Conclusion, in a perfect world, the dream is to eliminate all smoking and therefore all smoking-related disease. But unfortunately, it's not possible. Another dream is to detect genomic susceptibility in order to implement targeted prevention to avoid smoking only in these 8% of people that might develop lung cancer. But this is a dream as far as for today. In the real world, we can try to educate people about the risk of smoking, for instance, or having a bad diet, or exaggerating their certain exposure, for instance.
What we can hope is that innovations such as e-cigarettes, snus, or heated tobacco will decrease the harm of these very bad behaviors, and therefore will decrease the consequences of these behaviors and will decrease the risk of NCDs and the risk of cancer. That's what I do hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor David. It's always nice to hear from you and about the harm reduction in NCDs. And I leave the mic to my colleague, Dr. Ahmed Gharib, if you want to raise a question.
Small comment. Thank you, Professor David Khayyat, for this thorough review on harm reduction. I was really eager to listen to your opinion regarding the use of electronic cigarettes. As you said, in a perfect world, smoking would be the ultimate goal. However, we are not only our patients' pulmonologists, we are also their psychologists, and we have to play an important role to help them quit smoking. And even though Professor George Khayyat has concluded that future research is needed for the use of electronic cigarettes, I think it might be a bridge to help them ultimately quit smoking, and that might be important for their as a psychological approach when it comes to, for example, a patient has been smoking for like 30 years of cigarettes. I don't know what Professor Tariq thinks about this psychological approach, especially when it comes to Egyptian patients who are known to smoke a lot of cigarettes, and fortunately during the COVID era, the shisha has been banned recently. Please, Professor.
Actually, we're facing a major problem. I mean, if we're talking about Egypt, we have more than 30% of the population smoking, and even young adults as well. So the problem now we're facing for those addicts, and if you're talking about nicotine addiction, whatever, it's worldwide. We have stakeholders, as far as I remember, it's more than 1 billion smokers worldwide. And we tried several times. Of course, we as pulmonologists in Egypt, and I think worldwide, we're all anti-smoker, smoking activists. We're against smoking, of course. But I think what we face in real life, let's talk about real life. With a busy practice we're having in Egypt as pulmonologists, and especially with the COVID and with the lot, as my colleague Dr. Ahmed Gharib just mentioned, there is a lot of anxiety and stress. And the problem is we tried several times to give nicotine replacement like tablets, these patches, the varenicline as well, and it didn't work. It didn't work. We have the smoking cessation clinics in the Ministry of Health, and I think with my colleagues, it didn't give the proper results to quit smoking. So let's be practical and let's talk in real life. If you have a patient and he is unable to quit smoking, I would go definitely, I'm talking myself personally, to give him something for a harm reduction, just as a step down to quit smoking. Of course, whenever a patient tells me I'm unable to stop smoking the conventional cigarettes, I tell him, well, try the heat products, especially if I'm every time telling him, please quit, and he's unable to quit. So what are you going to do? How can you face this problem? So that's a question I'm raising to Professor George and Professor David. How are you going to tackle this problem? A patient, he's unable to quit. How are you going to manage this patient?
Yes. This is a big problem. Despite all I've said during my presentation, I totally agree with Dr. David that e-cigarettes and all these devices have to be useful. And I guess that there is the problem of manufacturing devices very different, very various. This is a problem because we cannot study these devices really to see if it could help in harm reduction. But I'm totally convinced that if a person cannot stop smoking, this is one way to decrease harm reduction and to help him with use of e-cigarettes or other devices. But I'm convinced also that we have to always put the goal in the face of the smoker and always let him think that the goal must be to stop completely, because it's very difficult to determine who is a person who is unable to stop, because all smokers will say that they are unable to stop. So this is my feeling. We have to insist that we have to stop completely, and we have also to help the smokers to decrease the harm with tobacco.
If I may answer, give you my position about that. You know, the first point is that if you look at the goal of the anti-tobacco policies in the world, you can summarize that with just one very short sentence. What is asked for the people is either quit or die. If you don't want to quit, we don't want to know if you can or you cannot, or you are strong or you are courageous or you are weak. What we want is you to stop smoking. But if you cannot, even though you know that you are going to have lung cancer, or even though you have already a lung cancer, that's your fault. That's your problem. And if you die, you die. You cost a lot of money to the country because of the care. You cost a lot of money to the country because of your bad habits. As an oncologist, you know, that's 45 years that I'm treating cancer patients, mostly lung cancer. What I want is not to eradicate smoking. I don't care. What I want is to eradicate smoking-related death, mainly lung cancer. I'm not a pneumologist, I'm an oncologist. And so I would use practically, you ask, Tariq, you ask what in the real world. So in the real world, what is important is to try to save these people. And what do we know? We know, I've been talking about this dose-response relationship. We know that one person who smokes 2 cigarettes a day and one who smokes 2 packs a day is not going to have the same risk of lung cancer. So that story of dose response in oncology is perfectly known. The second point is that when we try to use nicotine replacement therapy, we know now that indeed, whatever you use, I mean, the gums or the whatever, you're going to get some 60% success at 8 weeks. But when you look at the long-term effect, the long-term results, you see that you are in the range of 15% success at 1 year. So meaning that 85% of those people who have sincerely tried to stop smoking, being helped by NRT, will not be able to achieve that. So indeed, when I see a patient for prevention of lung cancer, I tell them to stop smoking. That's the only good, total, perfect goal we can ask them to try to get to. But as you saw, even those who have lung cancer, we give them chemotherapy, radiation, they know they are going to die, most probably, they continue to smoke. I mean, if you look at all the studies, we are talking about 60 to 80% of lung cancer patients that continue to smoke after the diagnosis of lung cancer. So practically, I mean, it's not that I like all these arm-reduced strategies. I like them because this is the only thing that really is going to do something in this real world. Regarding the danger of e-cigarettes, you know, the 68 deaths that happened in the United States, one can be very surprised that we didn't have even one case in Europe. Although in Europe, we have also smokers of e-cigarettes, I mean, vapors. Sorry. How come? I'm sure you don't have also in the Middle East, or not that number. I mean, 2,800 people affected with this syndrome and 68 deaths. We had none of them, no, zero. So this has to be related to something specific to the United States. And I think this is because in the United States, the way the e-cigarettes are manufactured, you can change the liquid. You can add something. You can, whether in my country, you cannot. I mean, it's fixed. You buy the reservoir, you use it, and you throw it, but you cannot add anything inside. And I think this is why we didn't have that syndrome, at least on a significant, with significant numbers that at least we would have known that. I mean, there's no publication, there's no report of that in my country, and I think more largely in Europe. So to conclude, the best thing, the best thing is to quit smoking. We have to explain to the patient, we have to explain to the kids, we have to, everything we can do to teach, to educate, to convince them. But when they cannot, because many people cannot stop smoking, we have to try to help them, trying to decrease the harms of the bad behavior they have. And to my point of view, snus, e-cigarettes, heated tobacco are very effective way to get an harm reduction. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I believe what happened in the States, and correct me if I'm wrong, the EVALI which happened was due to adding some dipping on the liquid. As you said, David, it's manufactured, the liquid, you can add anything on the liquid. So they added the THC, the tetrahydrocannabinoid, which produce in these young adults, which developed the lung injury. The EVALI. Not only THC, they added THC and some vitamin E derivative, because with this derivative, you increase the action of THC. So that's crazy behaviors, totally abnormal. That's right. So let me raise the question to the expert. Do heated tobacco products permit the gradual quitting of smoking? What do you think, George and David, about that?
We don't know. No studies.
No studies.
Can it?
But no studies. But if we consider the story of dose response in cancer, we can. This is what the FDA and the RVIM and Public Health England, I mean, all the regulatory agencies in England, in Netherlands, in United States have been stated a few months ago, a few weeks ago even, is that you should have in the future a decrease in the risk. But whether studies have been done yet to say that this is true? No. I mean, George said that. We need studies.
Yeah.
The good part of it is that these devices, heat tobacco, is much more standardized than the e-cigarettes, and I guess the studies will be very powerful to prove if the actions, the effects, the good effects, hopefully, of these devices.
The point is that the only good definitive study that one would look for would be a study with looking at people smoking heated tobacco or e-cigarettes and looking at them for 30 years to see if they will develop less lung cancer than current tobacco smokers. The point is too long. I mean, in 30 years, we will have even new things more effective with the innovation and the science. But we will have to look at some other endpoints, like some markers of inflammation, some markers of proliferation, something like that. These studies are being done both by the companies, but also by scientists independently to companies, and indeed even by the FDA, to my knowledge.
Well, in my practice, David and George, and I have a lot of patients, COPD patients, and they are chain smokers. They smoke as hell, and when they shifted to the heats or the IQOS, and I revised them after that, as they mentioned, and when I checked them and by pulmonary function testing, there was some subjective improvement by symptoms and by their performance. And I have a lot of patients who couldn't stop smoking, but they shifted to the heated cigarettes. So this is my personal interpretation for those who were unable to quit and they shifted to the heat cigarettes. So thank you very much, David and George, for your very illustrative talks, and
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hope we can meet soon, either in Lebanon, in Paris, or in Egypt by next year.
With great pleasure.
And please be safe and take care of yourselves. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.